Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the first president of the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, makes a huge compliment. He says, "Give me 2 Din Dayals and I will completely change the face of the nation." And Golwalkar gives Din Dayal the sole credit of building the Jana Sangh from the scratch to the making it a national party. Even non-Hindu nationalist politicians like Acharya Kripalani, not non-Hindu, non-Hindu nationalist, characterized him as Daivi Sampad, divine wealth. And anti-Hindu nationalist leaders like the CPI's veteran leader Hiren Mukherjee called him Ajat Satru, enemy of none. Din Dayal's ingenuity was reflected in his speech, in his search for an alternative philosophy, or what he mentioned as a third way, which rejects both capitalism as well as communism. His philosophy was greatly inspired by Sankara's Advaita monism and influenced by political ideas of Hindu leaders like Dayananda Tilak and Golwalkar. His seminal ideological tract, Integral Humanism or Ekatma Manavbad, became the foundational document of the Bharatiya Jana Sangh. And it laid down his vision for what today you are talking about is called Bharatiya nationalism. In fact, his integral humanism gave a sophisticated spin to crude Hindutva vocabulary and idioms by offering an innovative philosophical discourse that would transcend the ideological and political limitations of Hindu nationalism and expands its sphere of social and political influence. Well, you can see today the success of Din Dayal's philosophy and politics. Well, of course, the manifestation is the chair, the Pandit Din Dayal chair here. But I would really be, in fact, I sometimes wonder whether do we follow the ideals of Din Dayal Upadhyay. Even the Hindutva ideologues and practitioners, do they follow really Din Dayal's path? Does Hindutva become more milder as prescribed by Din Dayal, or it is becoming more cruder? So these are the certain questions to be pondered over by the followers of Hindutva and practitioners of Hindutva. He is not just a philosopher, but he lived a very kind of modest life. Well, cutting across, as I told, political parties, actually one can see Din Dayal's ingenuity in his simplicity and modesty. Now I come to my lecture. Well, for a non-Banarasi like me, speaking on Banaras before the Banarasis is a daring act. But coming from the land of Jagannath, I think I am brave enough to venture out the land of Vishwanath. I have used this title, Hinduscape. Let me first explain the concept of Hinduscape, why I have used. Well, it's not my innovation. I am extending Arjun Appadurai's idea of scapes. When in his modernity and large, he's talking of 5 scapes, where I am extending, adding, it's an add-on to this scape. It is religious scape. From religious scape, I am talking about Hindu scape. Well, This is part of the Hinduscape. I mean that Banaras Hinduscape is Banaras Hindu University. So let me explain. First, just briefly, known as Kasi as introduction, it is. Kasi means luminous, as you know that, I don't have to explain many things. In ancient times, and established around 3,000 years ago, Varanasi is one of the oldest cities in the world. Hindus believe that Lord Shiva resides here and Varanasi represents the entire cosmos. For them, the city is a tirth, a ford, a crossing between humans and gods. Varanasi, despite having a substantial Muslim population, about 30%, since pre-colonial period, has remained a stronghold of Hindu traditions in colonial and post-colonial India, which is manifested in discourses, practices, institutions, and everyday life. The religious scape in Varanasi is understood as the process of construction and transformation of religious markers on a landscape as developed in history, focusing on spatial, monumental, and performative dimensions of the built environment. I'll explain it, and how it shapes identity politics. Religious scape here refers to the distribution in spaces through time of the physical manifestations of specific religious shrines, monuments, and traditions constructed and divinized by concerned actors and believers. In Varanasi, both physical manifestations of Hinduism and Hindu population, because Hindu population is part of the Hinduscape, it is just not materiality, have constituted a Hinduscape which has been plural and multi-layered. I'll emphasize how it is plural and multi-layered, it's not homogeneous. Varanasi's Hinduscape is not just an artificial built space. More significantly, it encompasses cosmic divine spots along with host of natural creations like the river Ganges, springs, wells, trees, which have been attributed divinity, thereby being an integral component of the Hinduscape and intimately connected to people and communities. Thus, Hinduscape of Varanasi includes ideas and processes, institutions, actors and networks, discourses and practices, individual and collective actions, and it also unveils how religion is lived and practiced. The making of Varanasi as a Hindu sacred city has been a long process over 3 millennia. The sacred city's intertwinement with the sacred river Ganges make Varanasi's sacredness intense and unique. The construction and transformation of Varanasi's Hinduscape has passed through a complex trajectory of history, myths, faiths, rituals, patronage, power and resistance, involving numerous social, religious and political actors and agencies. More importantly, Varanasi's Hinduscape has been multi-layered, representing plural and diverse Hindu traditions and contestations, because I have used the word contestations in my title. Islam's entry and emergence of an Islamoscape, because like Hinduscape I am also using Islamoscape, transformed the religious scape of Varanasi. However, with the fading away of Muslim rule and aided by Orientalism, Varanasi has seen revival and recreation of a Hinduscape with renewed vigor, portraying the city as timeless and Hindu. Post-colonial India has continued with Varanasi's representation as Hindu. Hindu nationalism, of course, which rules India present day, claims Varanasi as an exclusive Hindu space and finds the Islamoscape an imposition on a Hinduscape. Varanasi first began as a prominent commercial center and soon turned into a religious center. Unlike other religious centers, which were usually detached from the seat of political power, Sometimes religious centers are not really related to political power. But in contrast, Varanasi attracted patronage of Gadavahalas, and a Hindu scape had already been set up when city was invaded by Muhammad Ghaznavi in 1001. With this began a series of invasions by Central Asian invaders, and the city came under Muslim occupation. Otherness existed in Hindu scape, but it was defined in terms of purity and pollution within the Hindu hierarchical social order. Though there were contestations between Brahmanical and subaltern Hindus, yet the dominant upper caste Brahmins often accommodated the lower castes, as the latter were indispensable to religious economy and rituals. I mean, they had little choice, they had to accommodate. A significant shift occurred with the arrival of a religious order, the Muslims. Muslim rulers made a rupture in the Hindu scape by destroying physical religious markers like temples and built an Islamoscape, monumental as well as special. By raising mosques and mazars, and also by converting a sizable Hindu population. Thus, another religious scape was carved out from Varanasi's existing Hindu scape. These two antagonistic religious scapes collided, intersected, and also converged. This is also important to understand. It's just not a collision, it's also a kind of convergence. While boundaries were rigid on religious lines, they were bound to be flexible on due to economic and social interdependence in everyday life. Even popular Islamic spaces like mazars became shared religious spaces between Hindus and Muslims. Varanasi's Hindu scape, despite Brahmanical dominance, was fluid in nature. Different streams of Brahmins and elites came from far and near, flocked to Varanasi in different historical times. I mean, you can see that, how different, migrant Brahmins came and settled, and that's very important to understand. So it's not again, the Brahmins are not again a homogeneous entity. While migrant Brahmins enriched, because they enriched rituals and religious practices, created networks connecting communities, locality and regions. Political elites like the Marathas shaped the built environment like the Ghats and patronized institutions of religious learning, displaying sectarian as well as pan-Hindu identities. Hence, Varanasi's Hindu scape should not be viewed as isolated and rigid, but as a dynamic process of construction and transformation, connecting ideas, people and network. Religious scape is a social space marked by physical icons, from small shrines to large monuments, and involves interplay of power relations. Muslim invaders tried to erase the symbols and icons of Hindu scape and uproot its power structure from the territory. After the decline of the Muslim rule, the Hindu elites in post-colonial and post-colonial India reversed this process by refurbishing and constructing a spectacular Hindu scape with magnificent monuments like the riverfront ghats, and created a vibrant Hindu public sphere with regular performative events like Ganga Aarti. Ganga Aarti is very recent, by the way. Following this framework, I argue that Varanasi's Hindu scape has evolved dynamically with periodic constructions and adaptations over millennia. Plural and diverse streams and practices have added layers of specialities and sacredness to the Puranic and Brahmanic Hinduism. It's not really all Brahmanical Hinduism of Varanasi. Moreover, with 1/3 Muslim population, Varanasi for centuries had a distinct Islamoscape which has again experienced many shifts over the centuries. Thus, the city's sacred geography has been recreated and traditions have been reinvented in different historical times, involving different social forces and actors, thereby constructing cities' layered spatial and sacred complex. Religion and the sacred, as any other human activities, have to grapple with social roles, questions of power and knowledge, and material life, and Varanasi manifests these without ambiguities. To understand this complexity, I would emphasize that the processes in the construction of Varanasi needs, I emphasize, imaginative, historical, normative, and interdisciplinary engagement. So the next part, I would like to identify 5 elements of this Hinduscape. The first element is, or component, whatever you can say, is religion, city, river conundrum. So this is a very unique city, right? So religion, river, and city. The second one, rupture in Hinduscape, as I have mentioned, and emergence of an Islamoscape. And I would mention, it is not always antagonistic, it is antagonistic as well as syncretic. The third, revival and reconstruction of a vibrant and resurgent Hinduscape by Hindu elites in colonial and post-colonial India. Fourth, the many layered Hinduscape, both Brahmanical as well as subaltern. And finally, the twin challenges of what Varanasi faces today. One is Hindu-Muslim polarization, and the other is the choking of the sacred Ganges. First is that religion, city, and river. In popular imagination as well as in textual depiction, because we'll talk a little bit about city, right? Varanasi, a sacred pilgrimage or tirth in ancient, is ancient as well as Hindu. The ancientness and Hinduness of Varanasi are not only eulogized in Brahmanical texts like Puranas and Mahatmyas, they are also emphatically endorsed in colonial literature as the sacred city of the Hindus, like Shering and others, like Habel and so on, Prinsep. So they are all talking about the sacred city of Banaras, and are acquiesced by contemporary researchers, also scholars, as a unique Hindu city of antiquity, like Dina Egg and the others. So Banaras is isomorphic with the Hindu world. It contains and represents all that is Hindu. By visiting Banaras, pilgrims may have a darshan or a sacred glimpse of all sites sacred to Hindus. The city is quintessentially Hindu, particularly ancient, as well as universal, cosmic, in a sense, timeless and sacred space. The romanticization of Banaras as a city sitting outside the mortal time, and as seemingly unique urban site with a particular Hindu religious character is problematic. Undeniably, the idea of Banaras remained in Hindu imagination for long, yet it would be ahistorical to conceive Banaras as an eternal and fixed space. There are many scholars like Lajarati, Vita Kumar, Fitag, they're all talking about this, how really to read Banaras. A critical historical approach would produce an alternative series of glimpses of Banaras as an urban conglomeration and an urban society grounded firmly in the historical. So we have to actually see the historicity rather than thinking it as historical. Varanasi is described as one of the oldest cities in the world with an unbroken Hindu history. The archaeological evidence found in the Rajghat excavations dates the city's origins to the 8th century BCE. The city grew into a vibrant commercial city and attracted the Buddha to Sarnath, located at city's outskirts. Emergence of Brahmanical Hinduism may be dated back to the 3rd century CE. Archaeological evidence in the forms emblems with Lord Shiva's symbols were available from that period. The transformation of Varanasi from a commercial into a sacred town took place between the 4th and the early 6th centuries. During the Gupta dynasty, Skanda Purana constructed the idea of Varanasi as a sacred space, which was concretized in Kasi Khanda section on Kasi, and one of the most important Sanskrit Mahatmyas of Varanasi. The text was probably composed sometime during the 13th and 14th century. The Muslim raids since the early 11th century perhaps provided the context and impetus to the construction of Hindu Varanasi. Of the 4 chapters of Kashi Khanda, while the first deals with the naming of Kasi as Abhimukta, and the second discusses the significance of the area around Manikarnika Ghat, the last 2 chapters engage with the river Ganges, thus disseminating the sacredness of this river city. Interestingly, many traditions described in this pre-modern text are still observed in the present-day Varanasi. Moreover, although a Brahmanic text, Kasi Khanda has possibly popularized many ideas about Varanasi, which continues to be sacred by the Hindus across India even today. Puranas and Mahatmyas glorified and popularized sacred Varanasi as the ultimate destination of pilgrimage for Hindus, describing the mythical origins of multiple cosmic city sites and benefits they will accrue to the pilgrims. So the sacred city very much still remains strong in Hindu imagination and coveted as a coveted destination for Hindu pilgrimage. Well, I'll just skip a bit that in the sense that we know that why it is called Abhimukta. Abhimukta is never forsaken, where Lord Shiva constantly dwells, right? It is eternal sporting ground of Shiva and his consort, the Ganges, right? The river Ganga. And Abhimukta refers to the idea that Shiva had never left Kashi, even at the time of cosmic dissolution, and would never leave ever. The myth led Hindus believe that Kashi was the center of creation and the cosmic city was bestowed with special powers. Secondly, Kashi Khand also identified sacred spots in the city with special powers, weaving many myths, like you have seen that the wells and the springs and the kunds, right? And everywhere you can find that the description how special power each element or spot carries. And as we also understand that, as Manikarnika, for instance, it was cremation space, but it acquired a sacred status and contributed to the popular idea that Kashyam Maranam Mukti, or dying in Kashi conferred immediate salvation. A conjunction of space, sacrality and believers evolved to lay the foundation of a Hindu scape. Some Hindus, even today, particularly from North and South India, earlier people were coming from North India, 4-5 states, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and so on, Bihar. But today you can also see that people come from like Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and other places, right, to die here, right. So to have a good death, so Banaras ensures a kind of good death for a Hindu, right. The family members bring the dying or ailing member who express strong desire to die in Varanasi. Many Hindu trusts like Muktila Bhavan provides, that kind of facilitates and the ambience and so on, so that they can get this salvation. Well, we also know that I'll not describe that. That the Panchakosi kind of understanding that there are many. This is all mentioned in Kashi Khanda and so on. Well, just little bit on the river. That rivers are prime sites of religious and cultural significance in South Asia. The sacred river is believed to be a crossing of three worlds: heaven, Swarg, Marth, and also Patal. Right? The Ganges, the most famous and sacred river in the world's history, is the most revered river by Hindus and popularly called Ganga Ma. The river Ganga in Hindu mythology is a goddess, a celestial and earthly river which came down to earth from the heavens. Since the force of the descent to earth would have been more than the planet could bear, Lord Shiva caught the river in his head to break her fall. He eventually let it drop out to flow as the river Ganges. These are, maybe these are the myths, but these are strong faith or the beliefs, right? And which actually make this kind of river as kind of iconic. So the Ganga, Shiva and Varanasi are intimately connected, forming an inseparable divine trinity. This trinity is not only cosmic, but also iconic. Religious icons, because I call it iconic, religious icons are neither essentially given nor revealed, but they evolve as socio-cultural constructs. So when you are talking of the Ganges, it's actually, it's not given, it is actually evolving as a kind of construct. Even artificial and natural objects become religious icons if they trigger religious communication and convey religious meaning. Thus, the iconic development of the Trinity, Ganga, Shiva and Kasi, constituted Varanasi's authentic Hinduscape. Now the second element, rupture in Hinduscapes, emergence of an Islamoscape. Islam first came to Banaras in the 11th century with the Central Asian invaders. The wealth of the Hindu temples attracted the hoarders to storm the city repeatedly. Mahmud Ghaznavi was the first to invade Banaras twice. Authentic account of Islam in Banaras was available from the time of Muhammad Ghori, who conquered the city with his commander Qutbuddin Aibak after defeating Jaichand in the Battle of Chandawar in 1194. Gadawahala rulers were patrons of Brahmins of Banaras and promoted construction of temples. About 1,000 temples were reportedly destroyed in Banaras region by Ghori. The number may be an exaggeration, because always we exaggerate when we say that, how many temples were destroyed, so you just give an astronomical figure. Banaras was kept under a governor after 1194. The settlement of Muslims took place in the city and some Hindus were converted to Islam. When Muhammad of Ghazni came to plunder Varanasi, he lost his nephew Salar Masood, popularly called Ghazi Mian, who was killed near a temple in Bahrij. Ghazi Mian's followers laid the foundation of Islam in Banaras by constructing his grave, Majar, who was thereafter worshipped as a great saint and martyr. The trend continued as graves and mausoleums were built for the Shaheeds, martyrs. So who, you have many Majars called Shaheed, Chandan Shaheed and so on, who sacrificed their lives in the cause of Islam. Thus many Majars have come up in the city, and Mohallas also very important. The Mohallas are actually the Islamic, kind of contribution, are named after the martyrs. So Mohalla Salarpura, Alwaipura bear the name of Malik Afzal Alwai, Salar Masood Sipa Salar, general. There is also a Majar dedicated to him named Alwai Sahib. Bakriya Kun is named after Muhammad Bakr, another lieutenant of Salar Masood, and also exists the Majar of Hazrat Malik Muhammad Bakr. So you have like Chandan Shaheed, Jahir Shaheed, right? and Malangsa, Ambiyasa, and so on. Varanasi's Hinduscape was challenged and threatened when Bisheshwar, the reigning Hindu deity of the city, had faced series of onslaughts by Islamic rulers. Qutbuddin Aibak reportedly destroyed Bisheshwar temples in 1194. Rajia Sultana built a mosque on part of the site during her reign. You know all Rajia Sultana between 1236 and 1240. She lived for very less number of years. She ruled. And Mahmud Shah Sarki moved the linga to the compound of another temple called Abhimukteshwar. These are also the kind of, it's not that, it's all destruction. It's also that shifting and, rehabilitating, right? And in 1448, which Sikandar Lodi destroyed in 1490. So it's a tumultuous kind of period. And in 1558, the present Vishwanath temple was built with the patronage of Todarmal, a trusted minister of Mughal ruler Akbar. Alamgir Aurangzeb, the intolerant grandson of tolerant Akbar, destroyed this temple and constructed the mosque. However, the city Muslims deny this vehemently because this is contentious, right? That one kind of description is actually, contested. So there is no kind of authenticity in this kind of representation. The mosque gets its name from a well, of course, in the temple compound called Gyan Bhapi. Gyan Bhapi is well of wisdom. The linga, however, survived, right, as it was hidden in another temple till its installation in the present Vishwanath temple in 1776. And of course, we know that, Bindu Madhav temple was also, kind of destroyed. And Alamgiri mosque was, constructed, which is called Darahara mosque, a finest kind of slender, kind of minars, right? And thus, Islamoscape was not only an imposition on a Hinduscape. For Hindus, it is also become a symbol of Muslim aggression on their faith. It is often argued that the motive behind destruction of temples was not religious but political. As the deities and temples were identified with the royal power, and their destruction was inevitable to delegitimize the conqueror, which Richard Eaton actually argues very forcefully, and it has substance. However, the temple may be a royal symbol of power, but it was no less a symbol of Hindu faith and religion. This was more so in case of Varanasi. The destruction of the Hinduscape and the construction of Islamoscape became a constant reminder to Hindus of Muslim aggression and affront on their religion. Intersection and convergence. This is also a very important part of this. When talking of emergence of Islamoscape, we must also see the intersection and convergence. Though an Islamoscape was founded on desecration, destruction, and domination, yet during the Sultanate and the Mughal rule, there was a moment of engagement with the Hinduscape. Though through negotiation, mutual accommodation, and even encouragement. Some reference suggest that Vishwanath temple was rebuilt in Iltutmish reign, 1211 to 1236, and Padmeshwara temple during the reign of Alauddin Khilji. This is, they were all actually rebuilt or constructed. Bhakti movement became popular in Varanasi during the Sultanate period, and Bhakti saints like Ramananda, Kabir, Tulsidas either visited Banaras or lived in the city, freely disseminating message of substituting caste discrimination and social hierarchy in Hinduism with fraternity and love. Thus, despite facing Muslim aggression, Hinduism remained the most popular religion due to its eclectic and accommodative character. New streams of reformative Hinduism further enriched Hinduism or Hindustan. In 1567, Varanasi came under Mughals and the city recovered during the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir and Dara Shikoh. Varanasi had turned into a Mughalizing city, which Pritag is talking about, as Mughal elements were superimposed on a Hindu city during the Mughal rule. However, Mughal policy for Banaras had a complex and varied history, oscillating between Akbar's liberal policy of toleration and patronization to Aurangzeb's intolerance, bigotry and destruction. 1,000 temples were renovated by Akbar's confidant Raja Man Singh of Ajmer in 1600. You know, it's a big number. That Aurangzeb's brother Dara Shikoh took keen interest in Hindu religion and philosophy and adopted a tolerant and syncretic approach. His liberal policies were reversed with destruction of temples by Aurangzeb. Many low-caste weavers were, of course, converted. So this is also Banaras also became a kind of Islamic, prominent Islamic center. Islamoscape is not about landscape or religious shrines. When I'm talking like Hinduscape, I'm just explaining that it embodies Muslims, their life worlds, social relations and networks. The Muslim world of the city is plural and diverse. It is again not homogeneous. Pathans and Ansaris, Sunnis and Shias, Barelvis and Deobandis, and so on. There is also a class division, rich and poor. But a majority of city Muslims, the weavers, work in the famous handloom silk industry, which has been existing long before the arrival of Islam on the 11th century. These Muslim weavers, called Julahas, right, within quote, are very likely Hindu converts from the same caste. Hindu money lenders occupied the central position in the weaving economy during the medieval period, as they were the only source from where the poor Muslim weavers could borrow money to meet their financial and social needs. This economic system created an interdependence among Hindus and Muslims and strengthened their bonding. So this is also a very important part when we understand it's just not confrontation and antagonism, it is also kind of convergence and syncretism. Now the third part is rejuvenation of the Hinduscape. Sorry, how many minutes?
Sir, you are the only speaker, you can take as much time as you want.
Okay. So I have covered, I'll be a little quick maybe, right? Okay. This is a little history, right? More, because I think that history is very important to engage with the discipline as well as, the events, right? With the decline of the Mughals in the 18th century, and installation of a new Hindu king in Banaras, new socio-political alignments emerged in Varanasi. The city's power structure was marked by the interplay between the Raja of Banaras, merchant bankers, and Gosains, or ascetic soldier mercenaries, who linked the city through their pilgrimage networks for the purpose of trade. Is William Pinch, written extensively. A number of Hindu royal and feudal elites from across the subcontinent, particularly the Marathas, invested in the material landscape of the riverfront. In 1735, Maratha Peshwa sponsored the construction of 3 ghats, Dashashwamed, Manikarnika and Panchaganga. The project included the building of stepped stone terraces in order to provide smooth access to the river. For conducting rituals in the Ganges, Brahma and Durga ghats were constructed. Manikarnika Ghat was a funeral ghat in the late 18th century, and Sindhia Ghat was constructed in 1835. Some Muslim rulers patronized and the construction of ghats as well. In 1735, Mir Rustam Ali, the governor of the province, built the Mir Ghat. The riverfront as a whole comprised of a series of stone embankments with elite residences, monasteries and temples. And today, perhaps, next would be the corporates, right? So the corporates are not there, but I think that the way actually the riverfront is being reshaped, you can find the corporates will pitch in, very in near future. The patrons constituted a homogeneous group of elites. Look, understand that these are kind of elites are engaging with this kind of reconstruction of this riverfront. And so rulers, officials of princely states, who are they? Landowners, merchants, mahants, abbots of powerful Hindu monastery. So you have all these Shivala Ghat to other ghats, like they're all mahants and abbots, right? Their objective was to display visibility, I stress, and demonstrate authority vis-a-vis declining Muslim rule, as well as the rising colonial power. So they're responding to the declining Muslim rule and the emerging colonialism. The riverfront as a timeless Hindu space had found representations in indigenous discourses and practices. The Kashi Khand and Puranas described certain spots, there are certain spots were actually mentioned in the Kashi Khand, but this is the much latter day construction. So the built-in environment of Varanasi, like the Ghats, though presented as archaic, were constructed between late 18th and early 20th century. So these Ghats were not perennial, it's not from time immemorial they existed. With this monumental architecture, the built riverfront created a fusion of the riverscape and the religious scape. So why I mentioning from the beginning, that is a very iconic kind of river and the relationship, the triadic relationship, where riverfront and the religious scape and riverscape, submerges. Thereby converging the imagination of the reality of the Hindu scape. The patrons also periodically organized public spectacles like riverside festivals like Buro Mangal, which not only helped the elites to garner social and cultural capital, but also connected river, religion, city and communities. The riverfront also gradually turned into a theatrical backdrop for rituals and spectacles. Colonial discourses also contributed to the representation of the riverfront as a Hindu space for its own rationale, as the colonial government, for its own legitimacy and interest, was keen to project riverfront's picturesque qualities, as well as to retain it as an important space for public rituals. Colonial attention focused on the Daswaswamedh Ghat and Manikarnika Ghat, the two principal public ritual ghats along the river bank, as they were great attraction to pilgrims and tourists. In colonial photography and paintings, the riverfront was the dominant theme. Varanasi, Banaras became an Orientalist commodity, and Varanasi was romanticized as a one-dimensional city with a particular Hindu religious character, primarily drawing from Sanskrit sources. So Orientalism and colonialism actually refurbished, reinvented Varanasi as a kind of Hindu space. Colonial construction of Banaras had a rationale in the political economy as well, because this is very important, that the city has emerged as a key urban site with both significant economic and political importance in North India. Banaras had long been an important center for the production and trade of textiles, including silk and muslin, and served as the trans-regional trade center, both overland and along the river, often conducted under the auspices of Gosains, merchants, trading conglomerates. The city commercially connected Bengal and Maratha, territories of central India. Moreover, Banaras' economic power was founded in the preponderance of banking families who made the city their homes and served both commercial traders and religious pilgrims. Thus, Banaras emerged as region's inland commercial capital in the late 18th century. In the context of political economy, the idea of Hindu Banaras became more important to the colonial state. Hence, colonial writings glorified Banaras as an exemplar of Hinduism, the principal seat of Hindu learning, and the stronghold of Brahminical faith. Princeps emphasized the city's historicity as originating in the mythological era as recorded in the Sanskrit Puranas, and noted that Kasi, or city of light, is a place, I quote, is a place of the most profound antiquity, sanctity and splendor. So now the colonial, there is a continuity between post-colonial practices, discourses with the colonial one. So riverfront at Varanasi in the post-colonial period, right, particularly between the Varna River in the north and the Asi River in the south, makes a fusion of natural beauty of a living river with performative rituals. So performative rituals is very important to understand the Hinduscape, the nature of Hinduscape. And of course the splendid architecture. Varanasi has wonderful riverfront with some 84 ghats. Well, if someone can do, see the names of these ghats, you can see, classify, you can see that, who are they, how are they named, right? And constructed for religious bathing and rituals, an array of shrines, temple, as I discussed, right? And along the ghats, one can see pilgrims taking, you must be going, so I don't have to really describe. So, but for Hindus, darshan literally means seeing, is a key visual practice. And the everyday, part of everyday rituals in a spiritual sense. Darshan means seeing the sacred or connecting the viewer with the divine. So you say that where you're going, you say that, I go to the temple to see God, right? So seeing is very really important. Raina Ek has extensively dealt with it. So when they go to the temple for darshan of a particular deity, right? That's for a visual meeting and a connecting to the god or goddesses, right? So you can see that I am seeing through the god, right? Or the god is seeing through me. And it applies to the sacred images. This is also to the places and so on. The ghats where the riverscape and the religious scape merges naturally have become an ideal space to enact different visual practices. So when actually you see the river and the religious scape and riverscape are converging and meeting, there actually you engage with your visual practice, right? And among so many ghats, some have special significance for their ritual prominence. Like Dashwaswamedh, called the main ghat, is the most popular one, where the utmost celebration of vision takes place during the Ganga Aarti, every day evening, right? A few other ghats like Asi Ghat, now it is proliferating, right? There are so many Ganga spots where Ganga Aarti is taking place, right? And there is a competitive environment, right? That who can beat the other. So the Ganga Aarti, all of you have seen. I don't see every day, right? But I come to see, right? And the Ganga Aarti is a fire ritual derived from Vedic fire rituals. A religious ritual performed every evening on the ghats to worship the Ganges, attracting pilgrims, tourists, local residents and so on. Undoubtedly, this ritual, which merges sacred and profane, has become a great public spectacle today. There's so much rush, right, that, you don't get a place to sit or stand, right? In recent years, the ceremony is conducted on a stage platform, and the steps of the ghat become, sitting gallery. Of course, you have seen, I don't have to explain. So, thus you find a unique amphitheater. So this amphitheater overlooking the Ganges, enabling the devotees an unobstructed darshan, because I'm talking of visual practice. So you can see the Ganges, the river, the goddess, right, the Ganga Ma, right, without any obstruction, okay, and pay direct obeisance to Ganga Ma during the rituals. Besides, colorful boats with tourists and pilgrims are parked under the waterfront, which bring more, they bring more glamour, right, and it creates a spectacle. The very programming, it is programmed. It's not done just like, any kind of ritual. So there are many studies talking about the very programming designing and performativity of this ceremony from beginning to end is very impressive. It attracts. The entire event, from blowing of conch shell sunk and singing of devotional songs to the choice of instruments of liturgy, you can see the big lamps, right, and so on, and the colorful costumes of the young priests, right, to the style of, and the style in which they perform rituals. So I am saying is performative, right, has been choreographed with great precision. This spectacle performed in an open public space create an active Hindu public. As the devotees and spectators, they are not merely passive observers. They are also active participants. So you can see that they are singing, they are clapping, they are, so they are completely immersed when actually, this ritual is, the arti is kind of taking space. So they are praying, singing, clapping, putting diyas and so on. Okay? Thus Ganga Aarti strengthens the bonding between the Hindu scape and the Hindu public. Because I'd say that in a public, Hindu population is a very important part of the Hindu scape. In recent years, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, occasionally participating in these performative rituals, right, has not only added aura to the spectacles, but has also successfully converted religious capital to political capital. Besides regular Ganga Aarti, Varanasi hosts numerous religious other festivals, right, I stop. Then I come to the last part almost, that this Hindu scape is many layered. So there are communities, basically I talked about Brahminical Hinduism, but here I will focus on subaltern Hinduism. In this section, a little bit on Brahminical, you can also see that in Varanasi is diverse, multi-layered, social hierarchy as class discrimination. Caste discrimination still afflict the Hindu social order, right? Brahmins constitute around 30% of Varanasi population and play a dominant role in this ritual economy and institutions of learning. Varanasi has been a city of Brahminical learning through ages. There are still many schools run by Brahmin Pandits who continue to promote traditional learning by disseminating Vedas to Sanskrit language and grammar. Most of these institutions follow the ancient Gurukul traditions of teaching, like Vidya Math, for example, right, Swarupanand Saraswati, and so on, and there are many more. Varanasi had a strong spiritual tradition as well, because spiritualism is also part of the Hindu scape, which attracted Westerners and non-Hindus to Varanasi in the quest of spiritualism. Ani Besant came to India in 1893, joined the Theosophical Society in India and advocated that Indian nationalism should be built on Hindu tradition. Deploying education as a means of revival of Hinduism, she set up Central Hindu School, which inspired, now they have college and so on, right? And foundation of, and also inspired the foundation of the Banaras Hindu University. Jiddu Krishnamurti, a renowned spiritualist and a follower of Besant, set up a school at Varanasi as well as to cultivate spiritual learning. Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, a Hindu traditionalist, I emphasize, set up Banaras Hindu University in 1916. Incidentally, the university represented a hybridity in learning and architecture, being both Hindu and modern. I don't know, whether I am correct or not. Hindu sanskaras, ritual practices require different agencies and actors besides the Brahmins. They are not the sole, creator or performers of rituals. Hence, despite existence of socio-economic hierarchies, interdependence between upper caste Brahmins and lower caste Hindus by and large promoted a harmonious co-living among Hindus. As the post-independent Indian constitution abolished untouchability and discrimination, guaranteed equal rights political, social, and so on, every citizen, irrespective of caste, creed, and religion, the marginalized lower caste Hindu communities started demanding recognition and rights. While asserting their social recognition and citizenry rights, at times, these subaltern Hindus came into conflict with Brahmanical Hinduism and the state. So here I am taking 3 marginalized sections of Hindus, or which I call subaltern Hindus, like the Doms, the Dalits, the Mallas, and Aghoris. So these are the 3 elements of what you call it marginalized Hinduism, and there is a contestation between them, and they are demanding, they are asserting their rights, and also at the same time there are contestations, right? They are contesting the Brahmanical Hinduism as well as they are contesting the state. So we talked about, because death is very important, Varanasi celebrates death. It is the, perhaps the only city which celebrates death, right? And is referred to Mahasmasan, and where you find that in this caste system, the domes, right, or the former untouchables, right, within court, right, that they play a very important role, right? Without their intervention, right, this process cannot be initiated. In fact, forget about completion, right? The first is that, that Agni has to be given, right, by this. So according to, so this is one, and but we also understand that the plight, which actually Jonathan Parry, who has done extensive fieldwork, and he wrote this book, Death in Banaras, is saying that, talking that, they are doing business in death, right? But exactly, it's not really business, because you look at their income. I mean, yesterday I just, verified. Earlier they were getting 300, 400 rupees, right? Maybe today they are getting, say, 2,000 rupees or so, right? And they're depending on, so their whole kind of dependence is on this kind of income, right? The Mallas, so there are many, I'll just condense it, that the state has passed certain rules and regulations, like banning, say, for instance, sand mining, fishing, right, and so on. So they objected, because the Mallas are claiming themselves as they are the sons of the soil, they are Ganga Putras, right? So they are using that kind of idiom. So who is more kind of indispensable? Because they are actually Ganga Putras, right? So they live, with the river, in the river, and so on, right? So then Aghoris, right? It's also very important. You know that the radical ascetics in India, who used to live naked on the cremation grounds, meditate on corpses, engage in cannibalism and coprography, and consume intoxicants out of human skulls. I mean, these are certain myths, but certain facts, right? These stigmatized ascetics took up residence on the wrong side of the river, because when we were talking of Hinduscape, we didn't really include the other side of the river, right? Because you know that if you take birth on the other side of the river, what will be your kind of, how you will be born, right? So because the other side of the river lacks the sacrality of Varanasi. This is sacred, the other side is not sacred. So how strange it is. But in the 17th century, Kinnaram, an Aghori guru, brought reforms among Aghoris within the larger framework of heterodox Saivism. So he claimed himself as a kind of, a Saivite. So he brought some kind of reforms. These reforms led towards a compromise with Brahmanical Hinduism, and a temple dedicated to Kinnaram found a pride place in Varanasi sacred Hinduscape. So you can see that he has shifted. The temple is on this side of the river, right? Not the other side. So in recent year, however, the Aghoris have moved away from their engagement with ritual, the stigmatized substances and so on, Avadut Bhagavan Ram established an ashram and a clinic to treat people with leprosy and other skin diseases using modified Ayurvedic medicines. Kust Seva Ashram, built in 1961 at Parao, has made an entry into the Guinness Book of World Records for claiming to have treated over 200,000 with leprosy. With such intervention, the Aghoris are no more socially marginalized sect. Avadut Bhagavan Ram's reformist organization, Sri Sarveshwari Samuh, has become a large social mainstream and politically powerful organization. In the last few decades, they have set up more than 150 centers across India, right, in North India particularly. And their devotees just don't come from the lower caste. I mean, when I interacted, I found many are coming from the upper caste, right, a very kind of not exactly marginalized section. Now, little bit on wayside Hinduism. This is another kind of marginal Hindu sites. What is wayside Hinduism? Well, we see that Vishwanath temple and all kinds of big temples, but we also see the little traditions that survive in Varanasi. So mega temples, the imposing ghats, they hegemonize the Hindu scale, right? But there are spaces where you find these are the roadside Hindu shrines. Their ubiquitous feature of the city landscape, Varanasi has innumerable wayside Hindu religious shrines, old and new, with great and small gods. The survey conducted in 2012 and between 2012 and 2015 reveals that out of 3,347 public religious structures in Varanasi, 175 temples are identified as large, 644 as medium, and 2,034 as tiny or small. So you can see the number, preponderance of these small religious sites, right? Of the 523 remaining temples, 157 are trees that were identified as temples, and 13 in addition to and apart from the several hundred temples of all sizes that are built around the trees. So trees are also temples. Wayside temples also you find in Western civilization, right? But when there is somebody dies in accident, for instance, right? So they are sites of fatality, right? But here it is not so much, right? The sites of fatality is a little different from the Western wayside kind of temples. So they represent popular and folk Hinduism, promising protection and prosperity to the devotees. Usually minor agencies and actors, individual and small networks organize and maintain the wayside gods and goddesses to raise some resources. Prolific presence of tiny temples in Varanasi Hinduscape suggests an assertion and identity of minor and marginalized little Hinduisms. One of such sites of resistance is Jogi Bir Baba's shrine at Rajghat. Beers, of course, the brave, are brave folk heroes, the martyrs who had violent death. There are hundreds of shrines in Varanasi dedicated to Bir Babas. These ascetic guardian deities placed in the makeshift temples and are worshipped for protection. As the folklore goes, Jogi Bir Babas would walk boldly in the forest of Rajghat in dark nights and protect people, right? The priest at the site of Bir Baba at the Rajghat site, I went to one of the important sites in Rajghat. He was a former wrestler. He has been registering attempts of eviction. The next to that site is an I don't name it, so there is an influential educational institution. So they want to really, take that kind of, remove him, and take that kind of property. So he has been registering. And thus, the wayside Hinduism not only claims its rightful place in the Hindu scape, they also assert their autonomy and identity vis-a-vis Brahminical Hinduism, and also resist the state elite nexus, because state is behind these big, corporate institutions, and they want to evict these small shrines. But these subaltern Hinduism, Hindu scape also accommodates. So one is that when there is a resistance and contestation, so always the Hindu, the Brahminical Hinduism tries to accommodate them, right? To some extent, right? Giving them some kind of autonomy or creating a space and so on. I'll not explain all that. So finally, the last part is almost done. I just thanks for your presence. That the two challenges, I'll not discuss it. One is that Hindu-Muslim polarization. Well, I talked about the Islamoscape, but we also must understand how colonialism actually, in a way, widened this Hindu-Muslim polarization. It's very important to understand. Because after 1857 revolt, as we understand, colonialism targeted what you call bigoted Julahas, because they participated in 1857, right? And so they are identified as poor, illiterate, stupid, and at the bottom of this. So this is also one part, right? So as colonialized targeted them, marginalized them, right, oppressed them, so they thought that they must connect to a kind of, they create a kind of pan-Indian kind of identity, even go beyond, right? So, so you can see that, you can also understand that how the certain policies, because their handloom policies, the looms, right, how it has impacted their livelihood and so on, is very important to understand, right? Varanasi did not have, despite all these kind of polarization, the only communal riot, you could see that in 1809, right? That is the starting, right, part, which, of a different kind of nature, right? And the second part, also we have seen that this polarization has led to a kind of, I can just give you an example. When Sara Ali Khan performed Ganga Arati, right? So then there was a kind of opposition. How can she perform Ganga Arati? Right? Ganga is, the river is the heritage, right? Heritage doesn't really, like the river Ganges has been used by all caste communities, creeds, right? There are Dhobi Ghats, for instance, right? So everyone had access to these kind of ghats, right? And so that was a big news, right? As I, that how could really she perform, right? But, river is a heritage, river is a common heritage, right? So, and Varanasi is very eclectic in that kind of sense, like all the, foreigners are coming, right, from Westerners are coming, they are performing Arati, they are doing pujas, the Brahmins, have seen that, they are given preference by the press, that you come and, you do it, right? And the Prime Minister Modi is also inviting, Japanese Prime Ministers and others, they are also coming and performing Arati, right? Then how can, one can contest, right? So river, as I understand, right? So polarization leads to this kind of distortion or a kind of understanding which is very, very kind of conceptually wrong, right? And the second is, of course, the dying of the sacred Ganges, which you are witnessing every day, right? I don't want to really talk about it, but I can only say that the High Court has taken a decision, the Uttarakhand High Court. Now the river Ganges and river Yamuna, they have got, they are now juristic persona, right? So once you make them juristic, that means, so they can fight, they can defend themselves. So they will not defend themselves. Who will defend? The state will defend. So in a way, the High Court has taken a kind of positive decision, making them juristic, kind of personality. So I just conclude with the last conclusion. The construction of the sacred city of Varanasi and its transformation through millennia has been a complex process which emerged and took shape in pre-colonial medieval period, got consolidated during colonial rule, and was carried forward in post-colonial India. The city-religion river conundrum has made Varanasi's sacrality powerful and unique. The process of construction and transformation of city's religious scape has involved myths and memories, texts and practices, faiths and rituals, patronage and control, ideology and power relations, and political economy and governance. So these are actually the main components of this construction and transformation. Various social, religious, and political forces have played their role in the making of this multi-layered sacred river city, employing different strategies, from accommodation and compromise to contestation and confrontation. Varanasi's Hindu scape might have a mythical construct, might have been a mythical construct or an innocuous imagination with minimal reality to start with. When it started, it was not like this. Varanasi, it is evolving, it is getting constructed. But this imagination cruised through history, following a discursive process to emerge as a distinct reality over millennia. Thank you.
काम कर रहा है क्या फिर ये चलो ठीक हो जाए क्वेश्चंस अगर जो आपके कोई हो एनी ऑब्जर्वेशन क्वेश्चंस तो आप उसको पूछ सकते हैं वी हैव सम टाइम फॉर क्वेश्चंस एंड ऑब्जर्वेशंस आल्सो